Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament Lectionary podcast for preachers and teachers. My name is Paul Essa. I am a PhD student in Hebrew Bible at Yale University.
And I'm Rosy, an assistant professor in the area of Bible and the Religious Studies program at Wake Forest University. We want to welcome you to this episode. We have preaching tips and insights for Sunday, September 21st. And thematic readings, which is the strand that we're following during ordinary time, is taken from Amos chapter 8, verses 4 through 7, and that is paired with Psalm 113. So, Paul, what are your thoughts on this prophetic passage from Amos?
Yeah, certainly. I think this passage is somewhat famous. Like it's quite popular out there, especially Presbyterians who read a lot of Amos.
Okay, Presbyterians, you get that?
But I think what is striking to me here is the theme of economics. There's a lot of mention of money and wealth and debt and business and sales and trade used here in the polemic that Amos sort of releases onto the people. And I think that also is a good pairing with the Luke 16 passage, the gospel passage, which I think we will get to towards the end. But I want to stay in the first few minutes here on the Amos passage and get into some of the details of it. Certainly, it is an indictment, and the people that are being spoken to here in verse 4 says, "Hear this, you who tremble on the needy and bring ruin to the poor." Clearly, it looks like the people that are being addressed here are the wealthy elites, people who have the privilege of using the wealth that they've acquired through whatever means against the poor. And two verbs here, trample and then bring ruin. I think it exposes some of the relational imbalance between poor people and the people who are rich in this particular context. The execution of power and the manipulation of opportunity to make money by squeezing the juice out of the rest of the people.
Yes.
Notice how the poor are actively being ground upon, like they're being pressed down by the rich. In verse 5, it gets into some of the exploitations, by describing some of the marketplace practices. Those who seem so impatient for holy holidays and celebrations to end, there's a mention of the new moon and Shabbat or Sabbath to pass so that they return back to business in verse 5b. And it's striking to see how, they make money by sort of twisting and rigging economic systems. There's the mention of like diminishing the ephah, enlarging the shekel, falsifying the weights, the balance. In other words, just basically selling less grain than is advertised, charging more than the item's actually worth, inflation, and then like tweaking the scale so that it doesn't measure fully and accurately, so that it can save more of the produce and sell it back to other people. And for me, I think this is like wild institutionalized fraud and corruption that we are all quite familiar with. And I think that the detail that Amos brings up here is very important for the sort of prophetic rebuke that he eventually concretizes and concentrates on. And I wouldn't think that any modern reader of the book of Amos, who's actually reading the world right now, would say that, oh, this is unfamiliar to us. It's an ancient version of economic corruption, but unfortunately, it does still persist with us. What do you think, Rosy?
Oh my goodness. When you talk about Amos, right? I mean, this, I find my students too also respond to Amos because there's some, like you said, perennial issues, which is sad. But although his language is, dated within the 8th century, right? And we're kind of thinking about a particular context. Here we are in 2025, and it sounds very parallel to the kinds of economic exploitation that we experience today, and which become the kind of the crux for voting blocks, as people begin to complain about this, right? So, which is what Amos is basically saying, right? I mean, there are consequences, right? For this type of behavior, and Amos is about to lay it down.
Yeah, but it's about to crash it down on people.
Here's what's coming.
There is something about the mention of religious holidays, like, when it says the rich, they say, when will the new moon be over? So that we may sell grain again. And then the Sabbath, so that we may offer wheat for sale. So basically saying like, let this holidays go fast so that we can go back to our usual regular day of business. There's a lot of like really deep inside things here. When I read, I was thinking about like the sort of relationship between religion and economics, but also when religion and religious practices become so familiar such that we just go through them. It becomes like lip service. It's just like this thing that we do on a regular basis, but it really has no impact on anything that we do outside of that space. Like we could just go and say things to God in prayer or in worship or in whatever, and then exit quietly and go back to a normal day as usual, right? And I think all through our prophetic literature, especially 8th century prophetic literature, has this sort of polemic against lip service and worship that is heartless and worship that is mindless and worship that affects no daily practice. And I think Amos is getting at some of these, details of what it means to actually worship, what it means to actually be religious, and how that extends to what we do on a daily basis, especially how we handle money and wealth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing I keep thinking about too is the way that Amos is saying it, right? There's something striking about his rhetoric. He is dripping with sarcasm, right? So, Amos is obviously a prophet, but he's also a preacher. So there's a particular style to the way that he's speaking. He's not mincing words, right? He's getting right down to it, and he is, making the altar call in a sense. Like, you come to God, or else.
Yeah, or else.
Right. That's the thing, right? In hindsight, you can see, and that's exactly right. Like the reason why Amos's words are preserved in some sense is that they are going to receive at least in the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, a judgment, an international judgment.
Yes. I think the very sort of last few lines in verse 8, buying the poor with silver, the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat, right? It's like the sort of
the chaff.
Yeah, right? Like it's, I think poetic, prophetic passages are so like deep with sarcasm, like you rightly said, but also creative with the use of words and the way they depict how society is organized and the depth of the corruption that exists, right? And over here, it's sort of leaning a little bit like the sale of the poor, leaning a little bit towards like slavery language, but more so the monetization of every fragment of life. Every aspect of life is sort of monetized.
Mm-hmm.
Human life and human beings are reduced, to just like transactions and things that we can make money off of, right? Again, we are not unfamiliar with this in our contemporary world. I think that we certainly can see it exist around us, like the exploitation of labor, for instance, like, large economies that profit from scarcity and profit from human need. I can think of the American immigration system, for example. I can think about like all these sort of like, world trade relationships and how they position themselves, especially superpowers of the world right now, position themselves against like other developing nations and other younger nations and younger empires, monetizing and exploiting the power that they have in a way that they can squeeze the best out of the rest of the world. And I think that for me resonates some of the buying of the poor with silver.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying too in terms of like the large economy that it's indicting, right? The larger institutions that are grinding the poor and commodifying them. Just a kind of top-down economics that Amos is calling out. But now we've been saying, right, the judgment is coming, right? Of course, Amos is saying that as well. But so far, right, this is just Amos's words, right? That last verse, though, what does it seem that God has to say about this?
Yeah, like once you get to like verse 6, you're like, okay, where's God? Where's God? Surely God responds, right? God responds. And according to the words of Amos, God says, the Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. And I can't but note the emphasis on divine memory. Remember,
Yes.
I will never forget, right? That God will not erase or overlook what has been done. And there are two things here. Number one, that God takes the side of the poor that have been trampled upon by the rich, in that the exploitation of the poor does not slip past divine attention. It is completely unforgettable. And I read unforgettability and I was like, that still seems a little too passive. I would like something a lot more active. I would like God to like do something more. But then pausing again to think about what actually it means for God to not forget, or for God to remember the deeds of, these exploitative rich people. We see that there are several parallels in other places in the Hebrew Bible. And particularly in this context, we see that the refusal to forget functions not only as like an assurance that God is going to show up, but also like as the initial groundwork for usually the active work and judgment of God. Look, for instance, in Amos 8, verse 8, this memory translates into earthquake. In 7, verse 11, it becomes like they going into exile. And then in 6, verse 7, it's like the collapse of the wealth and the system of the wealth, and then the power that the wealthy have. All of that collapses. So there's a lot. There is not just God not forgetting, but also that is usually followed up by something a lot more expressive that is less passive.
Yes.
The same divine remembrance in the liberation passage of Exodus 2, where the Egyptians are compelled to let Israelites go, I believe holds and secures the sort of accountability for Israel's own exploitation here, in that God draws on that same power, God draws on that same process, that same pattern, that same action to remember the poor in this particular power dynamic here in the 8th century. And so, just to say to myself and anybody else who is also wondering whether remembering or not forgetting the deed is enough, it's just to say that God's memory carries a lot of weight, but it's not the end of it. It initiates the judgment that these people would need.
Well, I mean, the thing that kind of strikes me in this line, too, is the Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob.
Ah, yeah.
Pride of Jacob. Now, a couple episodes ago, we also talked about this idea of pride in another set of passages, right? And the indictment of pride. What in the world is going on here? What is God swearing by? What is this pride of Jacob? Like, can you say a little bit more? Is he being sarcastic? Yeah. Is that what's going on in Amos's rhetoric here? And in what is God swearing by?
Yeah. I remember in one of my Hebrew exam passages, Psalm 46, I came across the same passage here. But over there, it says like the pride of Jacob, whom he loves, whom God loves. And then the other two places that this same phrase shows up is in Amos 6 and then Amos 8. So Amos 6, verse 8, and then Amos 8, verse 7.
Yes.
All of that invokes the same sort of language, but it's read slightly differently. And I can think of two passages, right? Two ways, two approaches towards this. First, it may mean God himself, where like the oath, like God swearing on himself and God's own being, swearing on his own being to act justly towards these rich exploiters. And then the second way is it could mean Israel's own arrogance, like literal pride, right? God swearing on Israel's own arrogance. Yeah. As in Amos chapter 6, where the same thing happens, where it says, I abhor the pride of Jacob. I abhor your pride. It's so stinky that I abhor it. It could be that God is also swearing on that. But either way, I think that the point here is that God is by all means going to do something about this. That is inescapable. God is present. God is able. God will do it.
I think we're like also kind of touching on the idea that pride can either be like the dignity or excellence of Jacob in certain places, right? This Hebrew word has been translated in more positive ways. But here, at least in Amos, the way he's using it both in chapter 6 and here in chapter 8, it is a negative treatment, like maybe even a sarcastic way of saying, I hate this about you, right? This is what I'm going to swear by. I'm not going to forget what you've done. So there's a real indictment, as you said, in this final line, right? So it sounds like we've been talking about some preachable themes here, but maybe we can make this more direct, right? How would you challenge? How would you guide preachers who are maybe seeking to preach out of Amos this week? And this may be the time that we also draw upon the gospel passages, where I imagine many preachers will be looking. But that passage, my God, right? The dishonest manager maybe makes the Amos passage spin in a different direction. Where would you think you would send preachers on this?
Yeah, so it sounds like in the Luke 16 passage, first of all, there's a lot of preachable things in Amos chapter 8 alone, right? If you look at that alone, you could talk about like, all the capitalisms that are going on, all the various forms of it. Like you can talk about various forms of manipulation and like, pricing and like all the economic injustice things that are going on. The sort of trading of the bodies of the poor, the experiences of the poor, or the situation of poverty, and that being traded for more profit. Like there's a lot of economic things to speak for and speak against, but it becomes a lot more difficult and nuanced, I would say, once we pair Amos 8 with Luke chapter 16, because in Luke 16, the dishonest manager is being honored for being shrewd at the way he handles money and handles wealth that is being given to him to be in charge of, right? That's what he's being honored for. And I understand that it does raise a lot of like ethical concerns. How is it that dishonesty is being honored? And how is it that is something closer to mismanagement is being giving a lot of attention here? Rosy, I'm curious to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I find this gospel passage to be really difficult. So I could see myself going to the Amos passage. But I think one of the things that you and I were talking about too is one thing that helps me is I think there's a temptation to say the kind of simple thing, which is that wealth is bad, that wealth corrupts, that rich people are bad, right? That doesn't seem to be, however, how the parable is working, right? So, and reading that with Amos makes, I think, a new reading possible in that it isn't wealth in and of itself that's bad. In fact, the shrewd manager uses that wealth well, and that's something that Jesus seems to say, hey, wealth in and of itself is not a bad thing. I don't think that's what Amos is saying either. It is the way that wealth is being used, right, that then indicts you, right? So here's the dishonest manager, but he seems to understand something, right? Wealth is supposed to help support life. And the crux of the parable there is that the manager is about to be fired because he's been found out for having handled the master's wealth fraudulently, right?
Yes.
But before he is dismissed, he realizes he still has a little bit of power. And so he makes some deals on the side so that when he is eventually fired, he will have friends at the end, right? And he very shrewdly kind of realizes, I'm too old to beg. I can't steal. I can't make my life any other way. So I'm going to use this wealth that doesn't belong to me to preserve my life, right? By buying friendship, by buying relationship, by investing in what really matters, which is, relationships that support our lives, right? So I think there's something there that then makes the Amos passage less sort of a thundering indictment of the rich, sort of less kind of like,
let's slam it all down.
Right.
All our millionaires must die.
Right. Or all capitalism is exploitative, right? Many of us live very well under this capitalist regime, right? And there are ways to live more justly within it, right? And I think there's something there in Jesus' parable that is quite realistic in that we all live in uncertain circumstances. We are all on borrowed time and borrowed wealth. And what are we doing with this money? Are we amassing our own kind of, future in which Amos is saying, hey, listen, God's not going to forget that. But are you investing in the relationships that matter? Are you investing in life, in the quality of your life and in the life of others, right? So to me, that's a really rich possible teaching in that it's not simply about the badness of wealth or the badness of any particular economic system, right? Exploitation is always possible in every possible system. So that's not the issue. The issue there is how will you use the wealth that you have been given? It is not yours alone, right? It is ours to invest. And so we've been given a certain amount of authority to use the wealth that we've been given in ways that extend and generate life, right? So that to me is the way that these, maybe these passages together.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, might help preachers to get to a place where congregations could listen, because there's no way that we can just go at our congregations and just be like, wealth is bad. We want wealthy parishioners. We want wealthy congregation members. We want folks with wealth to recognize their sacred responsibility to a larger community beyond themselves and their own immediate families, right?
Yes.
And if you are faithful with this small thing, this, I don't know, $100,000 that you now have, because of this great job that you have, or something like that. I don't know. If you're faithful in this, then perhaps you can be faithful with more, with what really matters.
Yep. Do business well, trade fairly, trade sincerely.
Yeah.
Let people have some, let people live, let people survive. Let's live together and share. That's the key point, right?
Yes. Right. Be successful, do well, do right. Be responsible, right? I mean, all those things which to me are, they're not necessarily to just indict wealth alone. It's the practices that we as preachers also can be thinking about for our congregations. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So, Paul, that sounds like we've given our preachers maybe, a few ideas here on how to work through these passages. And I want to just thank you for raising all those possibilities for us.
Thank you very much. If you want to imagine what we do as biblical scholars, read Luke 16.
Oh, let's be more shrewd. Thank you, Paul. Friends, we hope that you have found something helpful in our wide-ranging discussion today. And remember that if you are looking for more preaching tips and insights, you can find an episode on just about every passage in the lectionary in the library search box on our website at firstreadingpodcast.com. Visit us there, check out our resources, subscribe to our podcast wherever you happen to get your podcasts, and hey, if you found something we've said somehow helpful to you, leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you find us. We do appreciate hearing from you. And until next time, I'm Rosy Candital.
And I'm Paul Essa. Happy preaching.